Hi Mike, my name is Steffen. I'm Professor of Organisation and Sustainability Head here at the University of Exeter Business School on the Penguin campus. Thank you very much for coming to see us all the way down to rainy Cornwall today. And we do a lot of sustainability work down here, very much at the local, regional level here in Cornwall. Could you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, of course, Stefan, delighted to be here. I'm Mike, 19 years at Marks & Spencer leading sustainability there, working across business strategy, supply chain implementation, working with 32 million customers on making better choices, and also working to change the wider system within which Marks & Spencer participates. Last 5 years, been working horizontally across the marketplace, advising lots of boardrooms on how to develop a sustainability strategy and crucially implement it in practice across their value chains as well. Great to be here.
The glass is maybe quarter full or 3/4 empty, depending on where your mood is. But are there any standout businesses, small or large, where you think actually the glass is actually at least half full, where the real leaders that do have an action plan in place that really drive change from the front? Can you think of any examples where you say, these guys, they really know what they're doing?
So I could give the obvious answer, a Patagonia. And there is a business that's got the ethos, the strategy, it operates its day-to-day operations, its value chain in entirely the right way. But there's a tiny number of businesses like that. If I then look at the big corporations that dominate our lives, the people that we buy our food, our drink, our cars, our flights from, they've all written down, say, some big, bold ambitions. But I think in essence, most of them are saying, I want to make my existing business model, how I make money today, a bit less bad. Do I want to profoundly shift my corporate strategy, the product and service I sell, the value chain that underpins it? I don't see that evidence yet. Now I'm starting to see a few businesses produce something called a climate transition plan, a CTP, where they start to write down in granular detail, if we're going to go from 100 units of carbon across our value chain today down to the 10 that we need within 15 to 20 years, these are some of the really big, profound shifts that we need to make. And this brings us to another challenge we can probably unlock in a moment. Voluntary action versus regulatory or policy action. Because I've grown up in a world where, by and large, this has been driven by a lot of voluntary leaders, the Unilevers, the Marks & Spencers of this world, getting out of the trenches and saying, follow us. And some of your competitors and peers follow you and sometimes go ahead of you. Brilliant. But you can't change a marketplace. The normal practice of consumers, how they interact with it, the practices across global supply chains, without policy underpin that forces the whole marketplace to rise, still letting the leaders run ahead, but basically dragging everybody else up. And I think when you hit something like a pandemic, and lots of businesses stop dead in their tracks and say, we're just going to deal with the pandemic today. The voluntary leaders out there on their own suddenly look over the shoulder and think there's no one with me. And this feels very lonely. I'm charging people more for my products because I've done a bit more than everybody else. I'm going to stop or step backwards even to meet them going the other way. So I'm a big believer now that we've exhausted voluntary action at a macro level, and we need now that policy underpin to drive the sort of the common framework underneath. That is not to say that we don't need voluntary activity at the secondary level. Great example, the UK supermarkets are now working together to ensure that they answer the same questions in the same way of all their food suppliers. Thousands of food companies in the UK, all supplying into the top 10 supermarkets. What is the point of each supermarket asking a different way to get the carbon data out of their ready meal supplier than the other company buying off the same manufacturer? So there's an initiative called BRC Mantra, bringing that commonality together. I'm not sure you need legislation for that, but the fact that you have to have some kind of measure across your sector about what you're doing in terms of carbon, that should be a mandatory requirement.
That's, from my point of view, that's quite a significant thing to say. I see you as a corporate man. You've been in big companies like Marks & Spencer for most of your working life, and you're now saying, well, actually, we've tried our best in the voluntary marketplace, as it were, to bring about that change that we need. But actually, now we need policy, we need leaders, political leaders, to step up and provide a level playing field. I mean, is that basically where you've come to after 20, 30 years in the business?
The obvious answer is yes. I think you've heard it from me a moment ago, saying how much I feel I've grown up in that world of voluntarism. I co-chaired something called the Consumer Goods Forum Sustainability Work. I brought together all the world's biggest food and drink, consumer goods brands and retailers to work together. Deforestation, food waste, human rights, carbon. And it did loads of good work. It's still doing loads of good work. But there are still too many companies lying outside that. And it's still quite Western-centric. All the growth is in marketplaces like India and China. Unless the food and drink manufacturers and retailers of those nations join in, again, disadvantages in the global marketplace. But here, the subtlety in what I say as well. I do not believe there is a necessity or the political bandwidth to have a law on everything. If every step a business takes says, can't do that, can't do that, can't do this, that's not capitalism at its best either. So we have to find a way of walking a tightrope where we create a framework around big business that forces it towards the better place collectively, but doesn't micromanage every subtlety and nuance to get there. So, I mean, look at some of the things the EU's been doing. Done right, things like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, the need for digital product passports to promote circularity, they're great things because they force me, the producer and putter on the marketplace, to understand all the environmental and social impacts associated with the product. How I use those in the marketplace to engage my consumer, build new business models around circularity, for example, leave that to be in the marketplace to innovate and compete on. But let's make sure that everybody's got the same data set before they put it on the marketplace. That's your access to play. After that, don't try and micromanage every other thing. And the final thought on this is we still have this disconnect between business and government in terms of policy. You know, the local difficulty we've got in the UK with plastics and circularity. We've been talking about having extended producer responsibility, EPR, DRS, deposit return schemes to bring drinks, cans, bottles back when people are finished with them, and better curbside collection. It's all disjointed. So even if a brand or a retailer simplified their products, made it more recyclable, it wouldn't be, because the collection system that we all depend on is not working in the right way either. So we need more of a big picture, longer term as well, between government and business working together. But voluntarism on its own is dead.
Out of interest, are the corporate leaders speaking the same sort of language? Are they also saying, well, actually, we can't do this on our own. We need political leadership here? Because isn't it also true that companies are investing a lot of money into lobbying to prevent any political change to happen or more stringent laws to coming into force, right? I mean, the news is full of us learning about negative lobbying, I would call it. So where do you see the corporate leaders sitting there on that fence? How much are they eyeing up, how much we can lobby the policymakers, and how much are they saying, well, actually we need policy to step up, provide that level playing field?
So a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one is that we have grown up in a generation of leadership of the last 30 or 40 years, certainly my age, where there's been a neoliberal orthodoxy. Keep government out of our hair. Our job is to produce things as cheaply and as effectively as we can, innovate, and often that's worked on a superficial level, but boy, has it left a social and environmental footprint that's growing behind it. Most business leaders are educated from the business school onwards not to call for regulation. It's just not in the DNA, by and large. So I think a lot of business leaders have struggled to deal with that. I think the next generation of business leaders that come through will be much more open to one day I compete, next day I collaborate through sort of voluntary action in calling for change. But the world might have burned by then. It might be too late. So I see it, and you've already used the framing, a lot of business leaders sat on the fence. And they're sat on the fence because they're not sure that politicians will really see these through. So every time the UK government, the European Union has tried to do something semi-controversial, semi-difficult, I'll pick the topic of farming just to make a point, as soon as a few farmers march in the street, or a few thousand farmers as it's been, we step back, that's too difficult, can't afford the political risk of that, can that idea. And yes, we do need business leaders to step forward then and say, but we support that action. And it's not just the bad actors hiding behind those farmers, and their understandable concerns about the changing world, which again I'll touch on in a second. But we have to stand proactively with government leaders who are wavering a little bit and saying it's in everybody's interest to build a food system that's sustainable and resilient for the future. That's what we've got to do. Now, just this point about bad actors lobbying. We've seen it with cigarettes, we've seen it with tobacco, we've seen it with big pharma, we've seen it with now sort of big oil and big automotive. There will always be bad actors who want to make money, as much money as they can today, on a personal level and a corporate level, and they'll hide behind natural anguish and concern about change. So again, we underappreciate the need for a just transition. I think a lot of corporates get locked into a carbon bubble or carbon tunnel because we can talk about a logical, factual number. I've got 100 units of carbon, it needs to be 90, 80, 70, and then eventually 10. It's factual. When we start to say, but what does that mean for thousands of farmers that sell you beef to sell going forward? All they'll just have to do is they're told they're one of my suppliers. But these are family businesses that have been on the land for hundreds and hundreds of years. They're connected with their local community. So unless we find an emotional way of connecting change with communities and groups that are negatively impacted by the shift to a low-carbon sustainable future, we'll get nowhere because the bad actors will hide behind them. Look, you're destroying local farmers over there. That's big meat saying it, turning over billions and billions of dollars a year. They don't care about the plight of a few individual small-scale farms out there, but they'll cynically hide behind it and lobby against the necessary legislation against them by using the image of a farmer being put out of work. So change is hard, and I'm calling on political leaders now not to run to the barricades and say every piece of climate legislation or sustainability legislation is good and necessary. It needs to be interrogated, it needs to be challenged. There's lots of poor legislation that comes out in this space as well. But again, the final point on this, unless we find a way of actively changing the economy over the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to fall flat on its face because the world around it will be alight, we won't be able to sort of manage our supply chains, and consumers will flip from relative indifference at this moment in time to, why haven't you sorted that out? Because all around me, the world's on fire.
But it hasn't been a lack of trying over the last 30 years. So, 1992, I'm old enough to remember the Rio Earth Summit. Climate change was, the top topic discussed then. The Brundtland report published in 1988, I believe it was. You and I are old enough to remember these big events. So we've been talking about this for a long, long time. So. And social movements have tried, politicians have tried, corporate leaders have tried, NGO activists have tried. There hasn't been a lack of trying and to bring about not just change, but fundamental change. So what you talked about the lack of political action. You talked about neoliberalism. So what do you think has been the chief problem of why we're still 30 odd years on, why we're still talking about the same things again and again without seeing fundamental changes?
Well, there's a couple of things happening, isn't it? One is the very essence of neoliberal capitalism, as we know, which pays nothing for the externalities it generates. And that's worked for hundreds of years, where we had a world that could on the surface absorb our pollution and our social inequality that big business caused. But now we've sort of overtopped the reservoir. It's spilling out the impact that we're having now. So let's just challenge ourselves intellectually about the neoliberal orthodoxy we have today. And it's just not going to be sustainable into the next 10, 15, 20 years. Now, does that mean communism? No, it doesn't. Does that mean sort of state-directed capitalism? I don't think it does. But it requires us to do something very, very different from today, collectively. And again, this is the tragedy then of short-termism. I mentioned a moment ago, 30, 40 years of political, financial and business leaders being brought up to see nothing more than the next quarter, the next polling results, the next by-election. That makes it really hard to plan for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And instead, I'm saying absolutely, I don't want statism, I don't want 5-year plans, because I don't think those work either. But we as business leaders need to be really clear that if we don't want that imposed upon us from the outside, because we obviously seem to fail in the future, we need to step forward with a better way collectively of running our organisations. And then the final thing I think we just need to recognise, society and businesses always need a value case or a business case for change. There is a finite amount of resource, of cash in any society, in any business to drive the change that we need. And there's always another pull to use it. And we can all turn around as scientists and say, but there's 5 wildfires this year, then it'll be 25, then it'll be 125, and suddenly the world's on fire, and people go, Yeah, that's logical, but it's not happening today, is it? Right now where we're filming is quite cold and blustery towards the end of what should be summer. A lot of people look at that and think, yeah, it's overblown, this problem. And again, we've said it so many times before, boiling the frog, we just don't notice what's going on around us. Now, the traditional way that we as business or political leaders have dealt with that is waved a big 500-page scientific risk assessment at people and said, read that, and then you'll believe. And people are saying, I don't understand it, I haven't got time, And I think we need to be far better at making the case for action, not just the costs of action, but the benefits of action, how it can create new jobs, cleaner air, cleaner streets, better health outcomes for people and their families here and now, as well as saving the ice caps in 20 or 30 years' time. So I think there are several things at play. There are really significant intellectual and real barriers to action. And this is my point when I opened up and said, glass is 25% full. Because that's the 25% we've all really tried really hard to do. But within the constraints of our own mindset, the system which we operate in, we can't get to the 75%. We can't just do incrementally a little bit more. We need a totally different mindset.
So, as you just said, climate change is a long-term issue. It's not going to go away with even a 5-year plan, if there is such a thing. So, we need to have a plan, really, for the next 30, 40 years, or even longer.
Yeah.
How do you gonna, I'm not going to ask you for political recipes, but what would make a corporate leader who is, whose salary might be dependent on the current and future stock price, right? And who might not be around 5 years from now, let alone 10 years from now. So what would, a big company, what would make them really think hard about what they're doing now? The big oils are still investing in oil exploration as we speak now, right? Whereas most experts are telling us that is nuts. So what would make them change their way now if they're not around 5 or 10 years from now?
So I think the first thing is the owners of business, whether it's public capital or private capital, need a better set of metrics to judge collectively the value of the organisations they're investing in today and what they'll be worth in the future as well. And again, it's based entirely on potential profits in the future at the moment. Now, lots of people have intellectualised about that, they've researched about it, and they've had some sort of learned groups at Davos, for example, once a year about it, but nothing actually happens. But we need to go to the very heart of how businesses are owned. The second part, on a more positive basis, is transformation. We've seen the power sector and the car sector start to go through transformation driven by sustainability forces. The shift from fossil fuels to renewables, the shift from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. And there is no boardroom in the car industry or the power sector that is not thinking every day about what it means to shift. Is it the clean, long-term approach that I would want? Probably not. But every boardroom is consumed by the risks and opportunities by that transformation. It is only when a sector approaches that tipping point of transformation across the entirety of what it sells, how people consume what it sells, that you start to get boardrooms really taking this seriously every day, apart from rather than signing off a sustainability report once a year, say, yeah, 2% less carbon, well done, guys, move on. How do we make another dollar next day? So we've got to understand far more about these tipping points and what brings them. And again, we've seen with the automobile sector, a lot of it's been driven by policy. I've been a little bit damning about the policy framework. By and large, certainly across Europe, there's been a pretty good policy signal to send car companies planning for the long term, which they have to do with the structure of their value chains, to prepare for a very different approach or to be utterly wiped out. Now, actually, I think the most important thing that's happened in the car industry has been the rise of China. So I think what happened in the German car sector and the Japanese car sector, which have got car sectors that overbat economically for those economies and societies, 10, 15 years ago they thought, this electric car thing, it probably won't happen. The future is lean diesel, or maybe it's hybrid. Oh, okay, it's going to be electric, but it'll take forever to do. Meanwhile, China invested strategically, and again, you can argue about hidden state subsidies to sort of kickstart the revolution there. But it's now created one of the world's biggest and most vibrant export car industries that didn't exist 10 years ago in China. Suddenly, Japan and Germany fundamentally threatened at a geopolitical level by the shift of what they've allowed to happen with the rise of China on that. So then I'd take us to what sector goes next. Having said those two, the food system. And again, let's unpick this in a bigger answer later on, but I just make 3 points about the food system. It is the most polluting on the planet in its entirety. Most greenhouse gas emissions, water use, deforestation, biodiversity loss, but also impact on human health. Smallholder incomes, hundreds of millions of smallholders around the world. At every level, the charge sheet against the food industry is damning. But the second point is it's also the most vulnerable to the problems it's causing. It's making people sick, it's making the planet sick, it's causing extreme weather that's impacting crop yields, prices and crops, availability, that we need to feed people in the future. And then thirdly, it's the most complex to decarbonise. It's not a simple techno fix of diesel engine becomes electric battery. Took 2 seconds to say, I know it's simplistic, there's a lot of subtlety beneath it, but I can say in 2 seconds to anybody. The food system, I'd need half an hour to unpick what it might look like in 10 years' time to be sustainable. But that tipping point is coming in the food system. Fashion system, fundamentally unsustainable, the construction industry and infrastructure. So let's take a step back and understand strategically what will take us from making each of these sectors a little less bad each year to tipping it into this radical transformation quickly. And it's a mix of market forces, research and development, and policy as well.
So, Mike, you mentioned China, and we mentioned the neoliberal capitalism, the Western system, as some call it, has been quite ill-prepared for these strategic transformations that are needed. And you talked about China investing strategically in certain industries. I know you're not a politician, but since you mention it, and since you also said we need political leadership to drive change and transformation forward, to at least send policy signals to the corporate leaders. So, we can think whatever we like about China, but a more state-directed system seems to have resulted in quite some positive changes in terms of how China today is the biggest investor in renewable energy, how it is producing the most electric cars in the world, how it seems to, well, I'm a train person, I try to go everywhere by train, they have stomped up 10,000s of kilometers of high-speed rail across the country in record time. So the Western system isn't able to do that. It seems to lack strategic thinking, analysis, and action. So isn't that a case for a much more state-directed planning system? You said you don't want to get rid of capitalism, as it were. You want the entrepreneurial innovation that capitalism has on offer. But how do you bring the two together in a meaningful way?
And that's a really good challenge, because I think we need the best of both worlds. And I'm incredibly cautious. I'm making no defence of the Chinese system at all, because I think once you get statism, two things happen. One is you start to cut people out of the democratic process. I've already discussed, the impact on farmers, their ability to sell meat into a marketplace that says we want low carbon solutions. You've got to give people a voice. They've got to be able to sort of feel part of the solution, rather than somebody sat in London or Washington, Paris or Beijing saying that's the way that we're all going. That fails if you don't take society with you. So I want to make that point really, really clearly. But then you also begin to realise that we talk about neoliberalism as a one approach. But again, we understand that neoliberalism in the States is different from in Europe. The Inflation Reduction Act in the States has played to the way that America tends to be more comfortable with capitalism. Sort of investment in subsidies to kickstart marketplaces rather than draconian reporting rules, for example. Europe's gone down a bit of a different approach, and again, I've said that done well, CSRD and things like digital passports for circularity can make a real difference by surfacing the information to enable businesses and other actors to make the right decisions in the future. So I think it's all tied up. And again, I think there's a report came out from in Europe this week talking about European competitiveness relative to China and the US over the rest of this century. It's actually quite damning and worrying reading, because we've become we've got the worst of statism without any of the best of it. We've got all these sort of great sort of ambitions written down about how we need all these countries to work together. And again, forgive my political incorrectness, I'll just lob the UK in with Europe for now, just to sort of make a point, because we've got the same version of politics and capitalism broadly. But we need to find a way of firing up the European engine, the competitive engine, keeping some of what is the best about how we do business. And again, I've said some kind words about America. I see the world's very best and most sustainable companies emerging in terms of innovation in America. I still see a long tail of the world's worst companies out there making the world's worst impact, because it's just brute capitalism. There has to be something that drives those companies to participate properly in the marketplace or get out. Equally, Europe can't just sit there waiting for Brussels or London to dictate a pathway for the next 5-10 years. It needs to be much more entrepreneurial about seizing the opportunities. And I've made the point about Germany and Japan and their car industries. Something similar is going to happen around the food system in the future. And a lot of that will be about new and novel foods. And, let's discuss momentarily the rise of protein grown in the laboratory. So we've tried to encourage people to be vegan and vegetarian to reduce the huge impact of a meat-based diet. I don't think that absolutism, again, in people's life works. You will eat meat or you won't eat meat. We've got to give people choices. We can encourage them to be flexitarian, to reduce, to have better protein, or as in my case as a vegetarian, none. That's my choice. I'm glad no one forces it upon me. We've looked at plant-based alternatives. They've by and large not worked because they've been too expensive, they're not tasted well enough, and actually in terms of high fat, salts and sugars, HFSS, they've been quite unhealthy, ultra-processed foods, a lot of them. The next generation of innovation will be about, in effect, cell cultures grown in laboratories. 99% less environmental impact compared to conventional meat. But tens of thousands of people have grown up and live in the land in those communities, put out of work because this cultivated meat is owned by one faceless global conglomerate, turning over trillions a year, and it's staffed by a few dozen people in white lab coats. Is that what we want? So I think we've got to have more of a vision of where we want to get society to and the economy, but we've also then got to be careful about the interventions we made. I said a moment ago, we need to understand tipping points and how to accelerate them, not deaden them, but also to look out for perverse outcomes by rushing off in one direction or not. So, don't want the Chinese system. I don't think the US system works on its own in Europe, which is a different culture and different economy. But Europe needs to pull its finger out because it's going to get left behind in the race for a new economy and geopolitically controlling the future. And whoever controls those food systems of the future has got, a stranglehold in a bad way on the future of the planet.
Mm. Well, let's stay with food. So here in Cornwall, lots of food is grown, lots of pasture land, a lot of cows on the field, lots of people working in hospitality, etc. And the best and the worst worlds are sort of coming together here, really, in terms of, badly paid jobs, seasonal jobs. The local farmers often don't have a way into the supply chains. You have supermarkets built here and there and everywhere, but the local farmers have no or very little way to actually supplying into these supermarkets. So, some people, including myself, have explored ways to bring about more circular food, regional food systems, where we say, well, actually we need to support local producers, need to give them an opportunity to supply schools, hospitals. Maybe there's even a way for policy to say, well, maybe we don't need another Aldi, Tesco or Sainsbury's. Maybe we need another shop where local producers are actually able to sell their produce to a broad audience rather than the well-to-do veg box people. So, but then we have technology-driven future imaginaries here of all our proteins being grown in labs. Very, very different views of the future. And how do you talked about participation. I strongly believe that participation is very, very vital. How do we bring about change that actually all of the different stakeholders in the food system, consumers, producers, are actually part of, to bring about meaningful change? Are you seeing any recipes in certain regions or certain best practices approaches where you can really see some positive change coming forward?
Yeah. So what a brilliant question. And I think the challenge we've got here is there is no one magic bullet. I mean, I've simplified the shift in terms of transportation down from diesel to electric. And actually it's far more than that, because it's public transport, it's walking, it's cycling, it's all of the above, creating a low carbon mobility system in the future. The food system is all of the above. It's going to have cultivated meat in it. It's going to have the local farmer produce it with 6 or 60 cows that have always been on that land. It's the bit in the middle that's probably going to get washed away. So you've got a heritage store about a local farmer selling into your local shop, and you're buying it because the cows are six miles up the road. You know the farmer personally, you're glad that they get their income. There's a huge swathe, and let's just use the food system at the moment, of invisible, high impact food production that happens in the middle, that has none of this terroir or sense of connection with the community or the landscape. And again, the bad actors in the food system will hide behind this image of a bucolic farmer sat there, working hard in his field with a small herd of cattle, and think that's where all food comes from. It's a fraction of most of the food that's consumed on this planet is produced like that. And my point about cultivated meat is not to eulogise it or say it's the perfect answer or is necessarily the answer at all. It's to say, if we're not careful, it will happen. And we will wander into a future and we'll suddenly look round in 10 years' time and say, I didn't really want to end up eating all this cultivated meat, but it's the cheapest available. I know it's put all these farmers out of work, but it's just happened by accident. I think we need to be much more conscious of, as a policy system and an economic system, of not just where we're going to, how we get there. Because the last 20, 30 years, you asked this great question about why has nothing happened since 1992. Partly because we as big businesses have been in control of how much or how little we've done. I can put my foot down on the accelerator and do 2% more, or put my brake on and do 2% less. It's been little nudges. In a world of transformations, when new marketplaces, cultivated meat, electric cars, electric batteries emerge, suddenly you're not in control. And a lot of the conversations I have in boardrooms now is to say, you're about to lose control of your destiny due to sustainability forces. And I want you to be in control of those, stepping forward. And the same at a societal level. I think a lot of governments are not in control of destiny. And people still think they can push the accelerator down, push the brake down, and just modulate the journey to a sustainable future or unsustainable one. And I think there are bigger forces now happening, both in terms of the climatic impacts on nature, biodiversity, and lives and livelihoods, and in terms of these innovations like cultivated meats, electric car batteries, that mean unless you act decisively to understand the future that's coming towards us, you'll be left behind.
But is it not also true that there's a big cultural backlash against any of these developments, against the whole climate change agenda, or, everything that has kind of got a green colour in it? It's a huge kind of cultural stroke political backlash. Right-wing populist movements are on the rise everywhere. There's also a sense that a lot of people just see anything that's got a kind of a green colour to it as a kind of an urban, liberal kind of elite thing. Yeah. And you mentioned farmers. There are a lot of farmers here who would believe that all green sustainability things is for the rich people in London, nothing to do with us. Yeah. So how do we manage that situation? Because people are consumers, people are voters, and they're voting with their feet in large numbers in places.
So I just want to take off the table now the bad actors who are cynically stirring the pot on Twitter /X, just creating scare stories. There'll always be those. There'll be cynical politicians of all stripes who will seize on net zero as a way of winning votes today and stirring sort of disunity today. I just want to put that to one side because that's where we're at the moment. There are a significant number of people with concerns about a sustainable pathway to a sustainable future, net zero future, with entirely legitimate concerns. What does it mean for my job, my livelihood, my way of life, my way of getting around, my way of accessing things, the cost of the products and services I buy when I've got very little income? And I think because we've got this polarising debate between, on one side, the green lobby saying, we've got to act whatever it takes, and on the other side, the bad actors saying, oh, it's going to destroy the world as we know it. There is a truth in between. And let me just address this to the green movement for now. We have to give up a little bit. A truly sustainable future is not exactly as I, as somebody who lives and breathes this, would want. It is getting the maximum number of people comfortable with let me just use the word silver solution. It's not the perfect gold one that Mike would want, or the bronze, or even worse standard that the bad actors would want. But it's just enough that it takes the broad swathe of society with you. And we have to find a narrative, which takes me to the second point, the value case. Again, there is nothing really for farmers in this conversation at the moment. Supermarkets are not offering to pay them more. There is a new subsidy system that seems to be shrinking every day in terms of giving them money to farm the land better for production and for farming. And I think, again, it just happens in these distant glass towers in Paris, Washington, London, Beijing, etc., distant from people's lives. Equally, I would say to the farming lobby, the NFU that represents farming communities, absolutely stand up for their rights and their concerns, everything I've just said, but also accept there needs to be a shift in the way that we farm today. And it's better to be at the table shaping that rather than just saying, no, we can't act. Now, I'm not saying that's what the NFU do, but there is a risk that we just say, either we act on everything or we act on nothing. And we've got to find that middle ground. And as we say goodbye to this specific question, this whole point about green premium, because at the moment supermarkets say, well, I'm not going to pay you more, food manufacturer, because I'm not getting more from the consumer. Food manufacturers say to the farmer, you're not getting more because I'm going to get more from the retailer. And everybody else is looking at everybody else in a Mexican standoff, saying, well, until somebody puts some money on the table, nothing's going to happen. And I'll leave you with a simple thought on behalf of the consumer of the final product. Why should I pay more for a product that has not exploited people and planet? Because in effect, that's what we're selling today. I think a study in the States said that the externalities of the US food system are worth $10 trillion a year. The impact on negative health outcomes, the negative impacts on the environment. But everybody's getting that for free. And just turning around to consumers, many under huge economic pressure at the moment, say, well, that food system's on its way, but it's going to cost you 20% more. People are struggling to put anything in the basket. They can't find 20% more money. And this is my point about finding a long-term shared vision between the farming community, manufacturers, retailers and brands, and the policy system to say, we've got to square this circle. We've got to invest, we've got to find a value case by which farmers are paid to farm better, that brings public good in a demonstrable way, not just through the food that they sell, but nature-based solutions as well. But that won't happen through a bunch of random little activities that just happen to happen around the place. And again, I keep warning myself, this is not about statism and big 5-year plans, but it's a much better appreciation of where the food system's going and how we should prepare for the inevitable shift to a better place.
There's some people that would argue that another reason why over the last 30 years, I wouldn't say nothing has happened, but reality has always outpaced of where we need to be. So growth, isn't that the elephant in the room?
Yeah.
This continuous need for not just little economic growth, but if we grow the economies, and that's the ambition, I think, by the Bank of England and other policymakers, to grow the economy in a band of 2 to 3% per year, let's say, right? That's the sort of the goal usually. But if we do that, we're effectively doubling the economy every 20, 25 years or something like that. That's huge in historical terms. That's huge.
Yeah. So
there's some people argue if we don't tackle that elephant in the room, we can talk all day long about what we need to do in terms of sustainability, bringing down emissions and lowering our environmental footprint. That growth will always outpace everything we're doing. Right? What's your take on that?
But that's where we started the conversation, wasn't it? All we've done in the last 20 or 30 years as businesses and governments is make the existing business model, existing neoliberalism, slightly less bad than it might have been. But consumption has swamped any efficiency savings that we've made. So, that's where we start from here. So I've read about 20 papers in the last 6 months around let's just frame it as degrowth, a very charged word. You walk into any conventional boardroom right now and say, I want to talk to you about degrowth, out you go, I'll never see you again. So again, we go back to this conversation about ownership and capitalism, and let's just frame neoliberalism around 2% growth in GDP on average. That's the shorthand for it. I know that it's so much more, but let's just use that as a shorthand right now. We need to have that discussion. My slight concern about these papers I've read, as a scientist, I read them and nod my head. But the way that they're framed as almost campaigning pieces, the system is broken, we just need to flip to degrowth overnight. You can't do that. Literally, society as we know it today would collapse. You need a transition plan from where we are to where we need to get to. Now again, we can talk about the shift from products to services. We can all wave a mobile phone around and say in the past we used to carry we'd have a phone, a photocopier, a camera, we'd have all these gadgets have been folded into one sort of relatively small device now. But many more billions of people have them than all these other devices in the past, so the impact remains the same. I think we need to start to see practical examples of what we need by shifting how we create value for society. And growth in a good way. And again, I see lots of really good pieces of academic work coming out. I see far fewer people then turning that into a real world pathway to say, and this is how you could take an economy and society like the UK today and shift it to a system in the future which is fundamentally about a different form of growth that's not about physical consumption, physical footprint in the same way. I would struggle to articulate what that is today. And I want to see more people try and take a punt at sort of saying it means doing this differently. The food sector might look like this, the car industry, the mobility sector like this. And we need then a bridge between the two worlds to understand. Because we need to do it, but let's not be blasé about the risks of doing it either.
So here in Cornwall, we've got tons and tons of SMEs. In fact, most of our companies in Cornwall and the wider Southwest are small, medium-sized enterprises. Sometimes very small, sometimes slightly bigger. What do you think they can do to contribute positively to net zero, for example? I talk a lot to companies and they're almost always struggling. They're struggling with competitiveness, they're struggling with remoteness, they're struggling with labor costs, they're struggling with all sorts of things. So as we said earlier, if we now come with another demand, you need to lower your carbon emissions by X percent, but within the next 2-3 years, they're going to say, how am I going to pay for this? So, and Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are something that you can control more as a business. But once you start going into Scope 3, it's becoming very, very difficult for an SME to really engage with that. Yeah. Have you worked with SMEs? What do you see out there as kind of positive examples of how SMEs can engage with this agenda?
So if I went back to my Marks and Spencer days, 2,000 suppliers supplying products into Marks and Spencer. Many of those really big corporations, they should have a head of sustainability, they should have a plan to sort of tackle these issues. Many of them SMEs, as we would know them, and behind them 20,000 farmers, almost all of them S of the SME as well. I want those businesses to feel that they can do things under their own steam if they want to, but for the vast majority of SMEs, they need leadership, either from big businesses and government. So let's use an example. Some of the UK's biggest high street banks now are starting to create carbon hubs to support the SMEs that bank through them. So they're giving them a carbon calculator for free, they're showing them tips as to how to reduce their energy costs. There's a business case. They plough that money back into the growth of their business. So I think I'm looking that 80% of this is about large businesses and other entities creating hubs and support for SMEs to participate. If I just went to the average SME, talking all the things you've just been talking about, how do I grow, how do I retain talent, how do I sort of manage my cash flow, it's really hard to justify doing sustainability just on your own for many businesses. I think if your banking partner or the business that you're supplying into, a Marks and Spencer, ultimately has created a hub or a platform to support you, I think that's really powerful. And then obviously the local public sector down here, whether it's the councils, other regional entities, need to be providing support for businesses. And again, I think there's a crying shame across the UK that we've created this Cinderella around energy efficiency. The simplest way of saving money and saving the environment is not to use energy you don't need to. But it's not sexy enough, it's not got the photo opportunity. So whether you're running a small manufacturing site or a big supermarket or a domestic home, we have not looked at those energy efficiency operations as well. And the final thing, again, I mentioned this sort of example earlier on about BRC Mondra bringing these sort of data sets together. So everybody's got a common way of defining the carbon footprint of an apple or an orange or a fish or a piece of meat that goes into a big supply chain. I want the Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's, Tesco's to be taking a lead on creating that, investing into creating it. And that should then be driven down through supply chains to give these smaller businesses insights on their products and how they can make a difference on them. I don't want them paying to create a separate system. They should be given that insight and the tools to make a difference as well. So there are some ideas as to how we get smaller businesses involved. But it has to be led by the Lloyds, the Barclays, the Marks and Spencer, the Tesco's, the Vodafones of this world, driving support down through value chains.
But forgive me, I mean, what's in the interest of a Barclays or Lloyds or even Marks and Spencer for that matter to really invest in a hub of SME support in Cornwall? I don't see it. I mean, the banks are closing all their branches. There's no regional bank in some countries. France, Italy, Germany, etc. You have a hub of regional banks that have their footprint in their region. We lack those in the UK. What's in the? I see the opposite, direction actually. That things are getting more and more centralised, more and more. Efficiencies are being sought by the big banks, for example, centralizing everything, call centers rather than having branches. So is it really realistic to think that they're going to invest in a regional hub in Cornwall to drive these kind of changes?
It's a great pushback, but let me sort of turn it on its head a little bit and say, all these big banks, all these big retailers, other big businesses have made Scope 3 commitments to cut their near-term carbon emissions by 50% by 2030, by 90% by 2040, 2050. That's not going to happen by chance. Now, a big Tesco's can ring up a big Coca-Cola and say, cut your carbon emissions, and Coca will say, I've got a team of 100 people working on it, I'm ahead of you, no problem, fine. You're not going to get that with the farming base. So Tesco's needs to invest into a model, and these businesses are, these supermarkets are. Morrison's are working with 3,000 UK farmers on the pathway to net zero as we speak, to bring them the practical tools and support in the field to drive the change that we need. Now, do I think in the future that we need all these 10 supermarkets to consolidate their efforts into one hub for the future of farming in the UK in partnership with the NFU and partnership maybe with DEFRA? Yes, I do. But I don't think we're going to come up with an all singing, all dancing, separate approach being run. Equally, grassroots, you're going to get individual farmers who are brilliant. They're way ahead of the retailers, they're way ahead of anybody in the food industry at sort of developing the solutions we need. What they need is a way of amplifying and sharing their best practice stories. So there's a system called LEAF, Linking the Environment and Farming, a very good farming standard for the environment. They've got a network of 200 demonstration farms that individual, slightly sceptical farmers can go visit and say, so you can be profitable and better for the environment. I'll take these best practices back from one farmer to another, not from a suit who turns up from London once a year to tell me how to run my farm. So there are many ways of doing this. Again, we need to be more organised. And again, I would say to the people in the banking industry and the food industry, you have to get off your backsides and go through a bit of hard work to create that, because either you don't and the farming industry collapses as we know it today, or you have some kind of tax imposed upon you by a panicky government in 10 years' time to say sort it out at great cost and effort, be in control of your future.
Do you think there's a danger that everything gets reduced to carbon counting? And because you mentioned Scope 3, and I do see these conversations happening, and throw in Whitehall and throw in Brussels and even Beijing, and another COP is happening somewhere around the world, and we fly there and throw numbers around carbon emissions and how they need to come down, and looking at the metrics, etc. And then we come home and talk to our SMEs in Cornwall, and we say, okay, you need to reduce your carbon footprint by X, right? But that's just carbon.
Yeah.
sustainability is much bigger.
Yeah.
And the global challenges we're facing are much bigger. Early on, you talked about, we need a different value proposition for the entire economy, for the entire society. And carbon is just one really small aspect of that. But what I see is a danger of, everything is getting reduced to net zero and carbon emissions now. And we are kind of losing sight of what's happening left and right of that. And is that, so, I have called this, in my academic world, I've called this carbon fetishism, right? We're sort of fetishizing carbon and the need for reducing carbon emissions, which means we're so sort of obsessively focused on carbon, we're really losing sight of all the other things, including policies doing that, and the corporate leaders.
Yeah. Totally agree, Steffen. And we talked a little earlier about a carbon tunnel. And businesses, where they do act on sustainability with a degree of ambition, it's often because it's cold, hard, logical facts. 100 units of carbon, 10 units of carbon, pathway between the two. As soon as you bring in human dimensions into this, how people feel about the diet, their connection with the land that they and their family have farmed for hundreds of years, suddenly it becomes much more complicated. And business leaders and political leaders of today hate that. People talk back, their points of view, they're different from yours, they march in the streets, they go on strike. And we need to be far smarter in terms of building a wrap-round understanding. Now, my qualification is that we do run the risk of looking at every nuance and subtlety of everything that we do, and we never end up doing anything. I was going to do this, but there's 5 issues that might emerge, and then 10, then 15. And we come back to the fact, the reason also why we go back to carbon is not just it's a number that we're comfortable with as leaders, but also because the world is burning. And all other ecosystems and socio-economic systems are dependent on putting that fire out. So a bit of me says, yes, let's look at a broader range of factors than carbon. Of course we should. But let's not allow mission creep so it's 55 issues paralysing us in terms of what we do as well. So that would be my qualification on that, but absolutely, we live in a carbon tunnel.
Let's just stay with carbon there. So I've done a lot of work on carbon offsetting, carbon markets, etc. And you have, I'm sure you've recently heard about the sort of staff revolt in the Science-Based Initiative, where staff are saying, we don't think carbon credits are the way forward here for companies to prove that they're doing something around climate and their emissions. Where do you stand on offsets? For critics like myself, it's a cheap way for companies to get out of their climate responsibilities. For others, they say, okay, well, as you say, the world is burning. We need to do something, and at least I'm doing something. Yeah. Where do you come in?
Oh, there's so many issues wrapped up in this, but just to be sort of very precise, because the SBTI issue has brought so many things to the surface. I'm a deep sceptic about carbon neutrality and offsetting version 1.0 that we had in the past. And remember, Marks & Spencer committed to become carbon neutral in 2012, 12 years ago. Committed its own operational scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint by 40%, then offset the rest, driven by the desire to drive money to the developing world, where you get best bang for buck for each pound in terms of carbon reduction opportunity. The developing world is so much better than trying to make fridges and factories and stores even better in the UK. Now, after about 3 years of being carbon neutral, we decided to step away from it, and we recognised that we need to put the money that we were spending on offsetting back into innovation to take us on to the next step of decarbonisation, particularly to do with products and scope 3 as well. So we tried it, we realised it wasn't the long-term answer then. I think the reason that voluntary carbon markets have emerged is because governments are still struggling to meet their COP commitments for $100 billion of carbon finance going to other developing world governments around the world. A sticking plaster is voluntary carbon markets to pick up some of the slack. And there's some very powerful arguments to do that. These countries need those billions of dollars to become more resilient, to deal with extremes of weather today, let alone reduce and mitigate the emissions that they contribute to in a very small amount to the relative amount emitted around the world. So do I think carbon offsetting 2.0 or voluntary carbon markets 2.0 do we need? Yes. But I think I'll go back to the SBTI initiative problem started from, business have to get rid of 90% of today's emissions, today's value chain. There will always be 5 or 10% at the end. It's prohibitively expensive and difficult to remove. The SBTI was in the right place a year ago saying that 10% sort of maximum amount of offsetting. Now, obviously, the big tech companies who are growing fast in the way that today's conventional economy is not growing as quick as it did, are obviously pushing back on that because they're growing. They're becoming very much more efficient in terms of the use of energy and data centres, but AI is mushrooming demand for data. And they're really struggling to see how they can get to net zero without using huge amounts of offsets as we know it. My pushback to them and my challenge to them is we should only allow it if we can come up with a robust, credible system to do offsetting. Because virtually every attempt I've seen to date to do it has looked good on paper, has been a disaster in practice. Again, we've just had a story in North America of people buying carbon offsets in forests that have just been burnt to the ground in the wildfire caused by climate change. So you're in this sort of negative death spiral using them. So overall, I'm against. I don't think we should stop testing to find out whether the system can work going forward, but absolutely a 10% cap on their use.
Okay. Final question, Mike. We've been at it for a while, so thank you very much for your endurance here. So on a positive note, what you mentioned Patagonia earlier, and this is an example used again and again as a best practice example. If do you see any startups, small SMEs that might be tomorrow's corporate leaders, where you see something really amazing happening, not just in terms of technology, because often there's this kind of belief in technology will solve the problem, but in terms of how they organize themselves, how they really have a different value proposition, how they really engage with the customers in their communities in a different way. Do you have you come across even small examples where you think, okay, this might be the future?
So I'm really interested actually in a slightly different frame of this, Steffen, which is like the B Corp movement. So I think it's really hard for thousands of small individual isolated SMEs to pop up in an economy that's just not receptive of them, in a marketplace that's not receptive of them going to scale. Of course, some of them might transform in a good way to be the Tesla of the future. Okay, let's hope that happens, but by and large it's not. I think what the B Corp movement has done is given people strength in scale and togetherness, sharing best practice. It's a lonely journey otherwise. And we need more movements like that. So, the B Corp movement, we talked about Science-Based Targets Initiative, has been through its own ructions as it thinks, do I work with big business as it stands today, whether it's their individual brands or the entity as a whole? And there's a real great debate happening within there as to whether it should keep its purity and only work with pure startups and SMEs here, or whether it should dance with the devil, a big business, and try and change it within. But overall, the B Corp movement is making a real difference. Some of the really interesting innovations I'm starting to see now are around the world of data. So again, we can always laugh at Mike's grey hair here, partly through old age. But fundamentally, I was trying to track and trace 3 billion individual items that Marks & Spencer sold every year while I was there. A dress, a ready meal, bottle of wine, whatever. With a spreadsheet. A pen, a paper, may as well have been an abacus, the clay sort of tablet writing on. I think now with AI, machine learning, with remote sensing, you can do some dramatically different ways to understand your footprint and intervene in your footprint as well. So people like Nature-Metrics are using DNA sampling. Take one DNA sample from a river and you know everything about that river. You can follow a baseline to understand why it's under pressure, whether it's improving year on year or deteriorating as well. So these are the things that really excite me, because there are different ways of enabling change. And once I've got tools like that, and again, I started the conversation talking about CSRD, digital passports, because they were giving business data and insights to do things differently. Nobody in Brussels or London can invent a new business model. I can, if I've got the data. So these small startups in the world of data, I think, could be transformational. And I'm really keeping an eye on them.
No, thank you very much. Just last final one. Should Nestle be a B Corp? What do you think?
I actually think it should be able to, but with incredibly tight rules around it. And again, this takes us to the dilemma we've got in terms of society and the shift from being functionally less bad to transformative. Nestle is part of the big food system today. The big food system is failing, isn't it? So should we turn around to Nestle and say, you can never be B Corp, you've got to sit on the sidelines to become extinct in 20, 30, 40 years' time, and a B Corp rises to become a 10 billion, 100 billion dollar a year business, or 100 of them merge to do the same? That's not going to happen in practice, is it? It's just not going to happen. And I think the B Corp movement either needs to move to a situation where it says you can be B Corp certified in public on the front of your shop if you meet these set of SME rules. Nestle, you can follow a pathway to be a B corporation in terms of how you run yourself back of house and how you talk about yourself in your corporate report. Do we want you using it in your advertising and marketing? Probably not. And that's probably the sort of the pinhead I would dance upon to try and find an accommodation there. But I'm generally troubled by solutions that say, big business, you're the problem, and therefore we're going to exclude you, because big business won't disappear that way. It has been welcomed into the tent, supported and challenged in change. We talked briefly a moment ago and talk about how we can connect farmers with their local marketplace, cut out the big middleman, the big supermarket. And in the past we got very muddled, I think, because we tried to also create a single system for getting small producers' food onto a supermarket shelf. They shouldn't be touching a supermarket. We should be working with councils to find a local food market culture or local shops that sell local products direct to people as well. So yes to B Corp working with Nestle, yes to B Corp creating a network of disruptors in the future as well.
Great, Mike, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to talking to you, and very, very insightful as always. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure, Steffen. Thank you.
Thank you.